3 goals of macroeconomics. What's the point? Well, we want to limit unemployment, try to keep it under 5%, keep inflation under control, somewhere around 2%, and then promote economic growth. 3% would be a great number in the United States, and anything above it is really good. The circular flow model. This is kind of complex. You'll study it a lot this year. It shows how money, goods, and services move through the economy and how the government, product, and factor markets interact. Here's a pretty complex one from Wikipedia. You'll see others from your text or maybe your teacher. I kind of like this one though. It shows firms, factor markets, households, goods and services, government, financial markets, and even imports and exports. The product market. This is everybody's favorite. This is where goods and services are bought and sold. We look at things like prices and costs. The factor market. This is where we find resources like labor, machines, and capital, where we buy and sell those. Maybe we even employ them. Public versus private sector. The public sector is the government-funded part of the economy. Things like public schools, roads, parks. The private sector is run by individuals or groups. Things like corporations that run for a profit. Apple, Nike, or Starbucks. GDP and GDP per capita. What's the difference? GDP measures all goods and services produced in a country in 1 year measured in dollars. It's the value of those things. Per capita just adjusts that for population size by dividing it by how many people live in that place. The limitations of GDP. It ignores non-market transactions and household production. Think about it like this. Happiness, laughter, smiling, totally excluded from GDP. So is things like peace and comedy. But cigarettes actually boost GDP? Doesn't make a lot of sense. Investment. Investment is a really important word in macro. It does not mean stocks and bonds. It is business spending on new productive capital, like technology or machines, new space in your factory, not stocks and bonds. Intermediate goods. These are goods used as an input into the production of a final good. This is like a seat in a car. You don't want to count it until the car gets sold because you might end up double counting. The income approach to GDP. Here we add up all the total factor income, remember the factor market, earned by households, rent, wages, interest, and profit. The expenditure approach to GDP. This is really common. You'll use this a lot. We calculate GDP by adding up all business contributions to final goods and services. C, I, G, in X. That's net exports. Exports minus imports. The value-added approach to GDP. This is counting the production added by each sector of the economy. This can be difficult, though, when calculating it to avoid double counting of intermediate goods. It's still pretty common, though. Nominal versus real. You'll hear these words all the time. Nominal is an unadjusted measurement. It's a number. Real is adjusted, and we always adjust for inflation. Inflation is a change in price level. Labor force. Labor force is the number of people who are either employed or looking for work but currently unemployed. We can calculate the size of the labor force by taking the number of employed people plus the number of unemployed people. That gives us the labor force. Retired elderly people are not included, nor are school children, because they're not looking for work. Frictional unemployment. This is the idea that people are temporarily unemployed because they're in between jobs. They still have skills that are in demand, but they're currently unemployed. They should be able to find a new job, though. Structural unemployment. This is for people who are no longer in demand at all. Their skills aren't needed or wanted or desirable. They don't have a lot of value, those skills. This can result in the permanent loss of a job until new training and education is gained. This can be quite painful for people. It can also be expensive for them to go seek out that training and education. It sounds like a really bad thing, but actually structural unemployment is a good thing for the economy because it means technology is improving, our economy is advancing. Cyclical unemployment. This is unemployment due to a recession. Recession means weak demand, which means low output, and if factories and firms aren't making very much stuff, guess they don't really need very much labor. Hence, their people are going to be laid off or fired. The natural rate of unemployment, or the NRU. This is what we get when we add frictional and structural together. So we have zero cyclical unemployment, so there's no recession. But the NRU is never zero. We actually don't want it to be zero. If the natural rate of unemployment was zero and you opened a factory, how could you hire anybody to work there? So this depends a little bit on incentives and culture. You'll see differences in the natural rate of unemployment between, say, Japan, the United States, and France. Discouraged worker. A discouraged worker is a person without a job who was looking for a job, but they've given up looking. They're discouraged. They're not included in unemployment because they're not actively seeking employment. That's kind of a problem when we measure unemployment. These discouraged workers are left out, even though they don't have a job. Inflation. This is an increasing price level. It can be a bad thing because it weakens the purchasing power of money. We want some healthy inflation, but not too much. Something like 2% in the United States. Japan has struggled for decades with really, really low levels of inflation. Now, too much inflation, though, is really dangerous. That means no lending and no savings. Think about it. Would you put money in a bank account, saving it for later, if you knew it wasn't going to have the same amount of purchasing power in the future? And remember, if you're not putting in money into a bank, how is a bank going to make any loans? So no loans, no savings, bad for the economy. There's two graphical causes for this. You'll learn them later. First one being cost push. That's when supply shifts in or left or negatively. And the other is what's called demand pull. This is when demand shifts out. That's a positive shift or a rightward shift of demand. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The CPI is the most common measurement of inflation, but it has some problems. It measures the cost of a typical market basket. This is things that the average family is likely to purchase and consume and need. We calculate the CPI by taking the market basket price and dividing it by the base year market basket price and multiply that number by 100. The GDP Deflator. This is a little bit wider of a measurement, and it includes all goods and services, not just consumer facing. So this might include things like business costs going up. We calculate the deflator by taking nominal GDP, dividing it by real GDP, and dividing that number by 100. Multiplying it by 100. Multiplying it by 100. Sorry, multiplying. Business cycle. The business cycle is a graph that portrays the economy's alterations, fluctuations, or waves between recessions, sometimes those are called downturns, and expansions, sometimes called upturns. It makes sense on the graph. We have a few major parts to it. Notice real GDP on the Y, time on the X, and then this straight line running through the middle, we call that the trend line. Most economies grow over time. The lowest point on our line is called a trough. The highest is a peak. When we are moving between a trough and a peak, so upwards along that, we call that expansionary periods. When we are moving from a peak down to the next trough, downwards, we call that a recession. A negative output gap, sometimes called a recessionary gap. This is the distance between current low output and the long-run potential output. Remember the PPC curves? Unemployment is high. Typically, we have low inflation, but watch out for stagflation. That's an interesting case. You'll learn about it in Unit 3. And our GDP is also low. On our business cycle graph, a negative output gap is the distance between what we are currently producing, say right here at point A, and what we really could be producing up here along our trend line. That's a negative output gap, that distance there. You'll see it on other models later on in the course. A positive output gap is the opposite, sometimes called an inflationary gap. It takes place during an expansion, and it's, again, the distance between high output and long-run potential output. Unemployment's really low, inflation is higher than usual, and our GDP is high. But we really can't stay here for very long. It's not sustainable. This is the distance between our peak, call that A, and our trend line. Again, positive output gap. Thanks for watching.